morning everyone and welcome to the State of the Nation. So, the State of the Nation, no point giving you my opinion, here's what everyone thinks. The State of the Nation is that the LNP is sitting on 51% and the ALP is sitting on 49%. So the coalition's ahead by a whisker. But the true size of that whisker, or what actually happens at the election, will be determined by a couple of things. It'll be determined by what happens in the next couple of weeks. It'll be determined by what happens in the key marginals, and it'll be determined by what happens with the flow of preferences. So we've looked at a two-party, but on a primary vote we have Labor at 36.5, the LNP at 44.5, Greens at 9.5, so Labor needs a big swag of votes from the Greens, and others sitting at 9.5. So how they vote and how the cards are written and whether or not people vote the card, how those preferences flow will have a lot to do with the outcome of the election. But the other point here that I'd like to talk about today, we can't really foresee the future. We can all think we know what's going to happen, but a lot can happen. What we can do though is to look at the context within which this election is occurring. So first of all, we have today's context. So consumer confidence at 113.9, reasonably solid. Not the high levels we've seen, but still in positive territory. Business confidence at 117.3. Unemployment at 10%, not what the government says, around 5.7. And underemployment, another 9% of the workforce that are working part-time and would like to be working full-time. So that's that's the broad context today within which this all sits. But the other thing then is the bigger, broader societal context within which this election is being carried out. So broadly, as we all know, we have a growing population. So the population grew by about 22% in the last 14 years or so. We have an ageing population. Nothing new, we know this, but it makes a difference. So about 32% of people over the age of 50, and in some of the marginal seats that I've been looking at recently, that's over 60%. So there are seats where the large majority of people are older. So the ageing population makes a huge difference to needs and preferences, etc. Increasingly educated population. 27% of the population have a degree. Of course, that makes a difference too, because people who are educated will approach an election and politicians with a lot more critical scrutiny. In some of the electorates, again, that I've looked at, that's 50% of the population will have a degree. So, again, it makes a huge difference to the context within which an election and a campaign is run. Then we have an increasingly diverse ethnic nation. So we have more and more people that are not born in Australia. We have an increasing Asian group of people here. That last little bit shows a bit of a tailing off, but really the reality is it's about 10% of Australians were now born in Asia. And if you look at the people whose parents were born in another country, much higher. And again, I've looked at some of the seats where, you've got basically 90% of people born in Australia, and most of them were born of Australian parents, and other seats where it's more than 50% were not born here. So huge differences across the country, but overall a much more ethnically diverse country. Increasingly progressive. Many of you have seen this sort of stuff before. We know we're becoming more progressive as a nation. New Zealand is too, America's not. So this is just a worldwide phenomenon. But that plays out in a couple of really interesting areas. So the majority, 57% of people, now believe that homosexuals should be allowed to adopt children. So if you don't believe that, you're in the minority. And of course, this has huge implications for the question that's being put to both leaders about gay marriage. And you can see the population's on side. And the other area that this progressiveness is sort of having a play is with computers and technology. So people in Australia are much more open to and embracing technology. So we're seeing a call for the NBN, hurry along, just keep doing it. So these progressive attitudes play out in what the country really wants from politicians, even though they may not be articulating them in specific policy terms. Then we look at technology. So this election is going to be carried out, or is taking place, in an Australia where essentially more people have mobile phones than have landlines or household landlines. More people are using the internet or having broadband in their homes than having a home landline. So everything is at everyone's fingertips. It's all available. People can see whatever's going on. And we're seeing, see that line there, the red line going up, smartphones, more smartphones. So not only is everyone got everything they need to know available to them, but it's wherever they are. So this means information is absolutely everywhere. So for politicians, there's nowhere to hide in this sort of age. And news travels really fast. So this is the huge implication that technology is making to this kind of election. Yet the traditional media are starting to sort of fall away. If we look, we still see that TV is quite ubiquitous. TV's still up there, but people are watching fewer hours. We see that newspapers are dropping, although if you took any notice of Rupert Murdoch, they're obviously skyrocketing. But it's just getting harder and harder to use these broad media to communicate very broadly. It's a much more difficult area to be in. Now the real stuff, the economy. So real unemployment, and what we consider to be real unemployment is the Roy Morgan figure, where we simply ask people, are you working or are you looking for work, or are you retired or whatever? If you're looking for work, we say you're unemployed. So this data, the blue one is the Roy Morgan research, the red and black are the ABS or government statistics, and real unemployment has basically been increasing really seriously since the global financial crisis, and you see the two series diverge. The government stats would have us see that the financial crisis was sort of not a very real thing. This is just another perspective of unemployment, and this is about the proportion of the population that are actually working. So we can see over a long period that we had employment. The proportion of the population actually employed, working, was trending up. It's now actually starting to trend down as a proportion. You know, and I don't know whether you realise this, but the unemployment figure itself is a kind of weird little thing. It's the proportion of people who are working divided by the workforce. And the workforce are the people who are working or looking for work. So once you start doing figures like that, and that's not wrong or naughty or anything, that's just the way these things are calculated, but your denominator, that working or looking for work, is a moving feast as well. So if people drop out of the workforce, they give up, they're not working, they just don't get counted. But a number like this solid stuff, what proportion of the population is actually working, you can't get that bit wrong, and that's trending down. The other important piece is that it would be trending down much, much faster if we only looked at full-time work, because employment has moved very, very strongly from full-time to part-time. So the number of hours being worked in Australia is much lower, which means it's obviously an issue, a big issue. We then look at consumer confidence, and I mentioned previously 113.9, so 100 is the midpoint. That means equal numbers of people are positive and negative. So at 113.9 we're in the positive area. But what this trend is showing is that in the last quarter of this year, it's actually fallen. So it's lower, tracking lower in the last quarter than it has been previously. We also survey businesses. So we survey about 30,000 businesses a year, and we ask them about their confidence, whether they're looking to employ people, whether they're looking to invest. And it's quite amazing that business confidence and consumer confidence track very, very solidly. Business confidence, the red one, consumer confidence, the black one. Now, I wouldn't have predicted that. I would have thought that business had very different drivers, but it's one of those reminders that businesses are run by people. And we're actually seeing a really solid sort of tracking going on in business and consumer confidence. So business confidence isn't completely in the doldrums, not anything like it's been in the last little while, but it's still not in really strong positive territory. And we see business confidence is different by state, it's different by electorate, it's different by industry. You can delve right into it. But this is pretty interesting. Look at Tasmania. I reckon that's the Mona factor. For those of you who don't know, it's the Museum of Old and New Art. It's given Tasmania such a boost of confidence. Everyone's abuzz. That's my interpretation, by the way. I make that distinction between data and interpretation. And we see Western Australia now beneath Victoria. So Western Australia during the mining boom was way, way up there in business confidence, just miles ahead, but it's actually come back to something which is more like the middle of Australia as we speak. Then when we look at voting intention, now, you don't need to put your big long distance glasses on, you just need to look at the fact that Red's Labor, Blue's LNP. This is a two-party preferred, so they're like a mirror image of each other. I just want to make a couple of points. So, over more than a decade, voting intention or support for the parties moves between about 50-50 and sort of 60-40. So you don't ever have 100% of the population voting Labor or 100% of the population voting LNP. It moves within that kind of band. That's the first thing, and that's what we're seeing here. Between elections, the second point, between elections, which are always close, so elections generally come in around 50-50. There are some landslides, but mostly it's a pretty close election. But between elections, support for the ruling party tends to wane. So when we had the Howard government in, the Howard government came in, the economy was booming, things were going really well, and the population wanted a Labor government. It seems to happen. We are a dissatisfied bunch, or maybe, you know, all the promises just can't be met. For whatever reason, the big pattern tells us that the ruling party generally has this frustration and the population say they'd prefer the other lot. But what we saw through the Howard years is despite that, you know, desire of the country to have a Labor government while they had a coalition government, come election time, there was always something that managed to get the government back into power. So there were a number of issues, but they were always able to get back in until, of course, we had a change of government, and now we have the Labor government, and of course the people want an LNP. The third point is that a new leader tends to give a kick to the party. So when Mark Latham came in and replaced Simon Crean, that was a lift for the ALP. When Malcolm Turnbull came in and replaced Brendan Nelson, that was a lift for the LNP. When Julia came in and replaced Kevin Rudd, fabulous lift for the ALP. When Kevin Rudd came back and replaced Julia Gillard, fabulous lift for the ALP. So what does this all mean? To me, it's a bit like our interviewer incentives. You make a change and everyone thinks it's terrific, but it's not actually it's not the change that happened, it's the fact that there was a change. Whatever it means, we do see this kind of honeymoon period when there's a new leader. And so we've seen that very real situation in the last little while with Kevin Rudd coming in, changing the voting intention very strongly towards the Labor Party and then coming back again. This is just a more recent picture of what's been going on, and basically it shows gains for the LNP, or probably more realistically losses for the ALP, when Julia Gillard first proposed the carbon tax early in 2011, and then again in the whole lead-up, in the middle of 2012, in the lead-up of the introduction, the real introduction of the carbon tax and the mining tax in 2012. So that's sort of the context within which these things are happening. And then we look at attitudes towards the government, and we track these views about whether people trust the government or whether they think the government's doing a good job running the country. And again, you see this really interesting situation. In the Howard era, we had really, really high levels of distrust. So here, 57.8. Our level of distrust in the government now is even higher than that. So, you know, this is a higher level of distrust than Howard government at its most unpopular. But let's not forget that immediately after that level of unpopularity or distrust in the Howard government, the Howard LNP government was returned. Just after the September 11 and just after the children overboard claims. So even having these high levels of distrust doesn't mean that the election is a foregone conclusion. I think that's the really important message here. Useful then to look at this election compared to the last election and just see what's really changed. If we look at sort of a fairly bland set of priorities, it's still about costs, it's still about health, it's still about the economy, but let's look at something a bit more, I suppose, pointy. And this is this fabulous question where we ask people, what is the most important issue facing the world, and then what's the most important issue facing Australia? And they can say anything they like. So that you can see here the last election in 2010, essentially as a world issue, the environment and the economy were level pegging. They were the two issues vying for people's concerns. Clearly now, it's all about the economy. So people are concerned about things economic. Almost half the population of Australia think that the economy and economic things is the most important issue facing the world. The environment has come down to 17%. When we then look at issues facing Australia, pretty similar picture. By 2010, the last election, the economy had already outstripped the environment as an issue for Australia, but not by that much. There was still an environmental concern that was an issue for Australians. If we look now, we see economic issues, they're just way up there. The environment's way down. The economic issues are the things that absolutely is the context for this election. And just putting it into just two bars rather than a wiggly chart that shows all of the differences, we see clearly economic issues have gone from 28% last election up to 49%. We see the environment going down. And this is the point that Gary made earlier. The economy is like code for a bundle of things. It's what people mean by cost of living, taxation, getting the economy moving, and unemployment. And unemployment is now seen as the single most important issue by 11% of the population, or 11% of electors. That's up from about 4%. Huge difference, a really, really huge difference. And with real unemployment at 10%, up from about 6% in 2010, this is a big change. This is a really serious change, and it's a change that's reflected in people's minds as well. So what are they actually saying? Here's just some of the quotes that people are talking about and saying when we ask them these questions. So they say the economy, everyone just keeps borrowing money, but who's going to pay for it? There's not enough money to go round, businesses are closing down. The economy is important, it's the engine for the country, but the economy is the main thing. We need to get the Australian economy going. Refugees and asylum seekers is one of those sleeper issues. It raises its head and then it sort of goes away because it gets other issues take priority. But as we'll see in some of the marginal seats, it's a really huge issue, and in other marginal seats, it just is a non-issue. But for some, asylum seekers are really important, and people, for the most part, who are voicing asylum seeker issues are using language about turning back the boats. We're not seeing too much rising as an issue with people saying positive things about wanting to do the right thing for asylum seekers, make sure that they're homed here properly. People feel that, but it's not being raised as a major issue. The people who are speaking out about this issue at the top of their voice as a major issue are the ones who are saying turn back the boats. Unemployment's coming through as an issue, the availability of secure jobs, so people are concerned not only about their own job, people have friends who've lost their job, they've got family who've lost their job, they've got children that know they're not going to get a job out of university. So it's a thing that's now taking on a life of its own, and people are concerned about their own job security as well. And then they also mention individual industries that are close to them in their electorate and how the problems in those industries are being reflected in unemployment concerns. And people are also getting levels of frustration with politicians. Now, I think these are levels that we haven't seen before, and particularly in some of the seats. One of the seats we looked at close to Canberra was showing incredible frustration with politicians. So this does seem to be an issue, whether it's around incompetence, whether it's around trust, but there's definitely leadership issues that people are frustrated with. So if we then look about some serious changes or real changes. Consumer confidence, we went into the last election with consumer confidence pretty strong in the 20s, 120, now down to 114 in the last month, or 113 most recently. The economy appears to be improving. We went into the last election having come out of the GFC thinking that the economy was on the increase. We now no longer think that. The view that the economy is improving is a minority. Cutting down spending, it didn't seem to stop us spending, and worrying about interest rates is not so much of an issue. But in most of the economic issues that I looked at, it was like we went into 2010, it wasn't particularly good, but it was looking better. Whereas now it looks as if many of the indicators are actually looking worse. Government attitudes, the government doing a good job for the country, was reasonably high, wasn't about half before the last election, now it's much lower, and distrust in the government is much higher. We're a little bit more progressive these days, so homosexual couples being allowed to adopt children, that kind of proxy, if you like, for gay marriage, was less than a majority in the last election. It's now a majority view. So I think that's an important point. So we then look at which party is considered better for all of these issues. It's one thing to have an issue, but so what does that mean? Who are you going to vote for? So we all know that traditionally that the Labor Party's been seen as better for things like health, education, all the social issues, probably unemployment, things like the environment were Labor Party territory. Liberal National Party territory was more about the economy, managing the economy. Nobody has tended to own the space about open and honest government. That's been something that the electorate's rather careful about giving scores to. So what's happened over the last little while? What we saw in the last election, going into the last election, yep, the Labor Party was seen as better for health. That's been neutralised. We now have both parties the same. Better for the economy, the LNP was ahead, and it's more substantially ahead today going into this election. Which party's better for honest government? Neck and neck, and now we've actually seen the LNP pull ahead. I think this is a little bit to do with that issue I mentioned before, that we're quite critical of the current government, whatever it is. So that's part of the story. But this has been a situation where we saw with the voting intention that Julia Gillard really struggled with changing things like the carbon tax, which has obviously resonated. Better for education, that issue has been basically brought back to even Steven. The Labor Party's marginally ahead on education, but there's not a huge difference. Global warming and the environment, again, the issue has been neutralised. So it used to be a strong Labor issue. Now both parties are pretty much seen as the same, but that issue has really gone off the radar to a large extent as a very important issue. So let's look at some of the marginals. If we look broadly at some of these marginals, I think the key thing is there are some really consistent top issues. Cost of living, health and the economy are pretty much in the top 3 or 4 in all of them. But it's in the other issues where we actually see real differences, and that's what reminds us that Australians aren't just a homogeneous bunch. We're actually quite different all around the country. So if we look at something like consumer confidence, and this is sort of showing the dark areas of where there's high levels of consumer confidence and the lower levels of consumer confidence. But the key thing is there's a huge difference. Consumer confidence can be 135, 136 in one electorate and 91 in another electorate. So a 40-point gap between the highest and the lowest, and the marginal ALP seats in the bottom quintile. So the Labor Party has to really watch out which marginal seats they're going to lose, and obviously the LNP is tackling these marginal seats. The ones that are at risk are clearly ones that have low levels of consumer confidence, and they include things like Rankin in Queensland, Blair in Queensland, Kingsford Smith in New South Wales, and Page in northern New South Wales. Then we look at unemployment. Again, huge differences, extraordinary differences. Some places there is no unemployment. Other places unemployment is running at 21%. 1 in 5 people in the workforce don't have a job. So the key marginal seats with high unemployment, and there's a lot of them, and that's really important. These key marginals, high unemployment, big risk for the Labor Party. In Petrie in Queensland, 18.5% unemployment. Kingsford Smith in New South Wales, 12.7. Corangamite in Victoria, 12.7. Brand in Western Australia, 12.7. Eden Monaro in New South Wales, 12.3. Chisholm, 12. Blair in Queensland, 12. Capricornia and Robertson in New South Wales, just over 11. So these are all really important seats that the Labor Party will be obviously extremely worried about. Marginal LNP seats also have some high unemployment levels, like Macmillan in Victoria is running at 15%, and Canning in Western Australia 12.3%. So I think the issue, though, with unemployment is that it's a Labor seat to lose rather than an LNP seat to lose, because that will be seen as an issue that the government hasn't performed on. Health services and hospitals, again, huge differences. So in a place like Lyons in Tasmania, for almost half the population, health services and hospitals is the biggest single issue facing Australia, or the biggest single issue that the government could do something about that would help them. The marginal seats that are really threatened by this issue are Eden Monaro and Corangamite, and both of those are in the high 30% of electors say it's the most important issue facing them. Managing the economy, real danger spots for the ALP would be Reid in New South Wales, Robertson in New South Wales and Corangamite in Victoria. Not looking good for Corangamite for the ALP. Open and honest government. Again, there's differences across the area, but not so great. Not so great as we've seen. Danger spots for the ALP will be Page in northern New South Wales and Eden Monaro. Improving education, Graindler in New South Wales, Rankin in Queensland, Reid in New South Wales and Deakin in Victoria would be the danger spots. And then when it comes to illegal immigrants, or reducing the number of boat people, however this is expressed, you see big differences, don't we? We see in a place like Maranoa in Queensland, 23% of the population say it's the biggest issue that the government could do something about for them and their family. And in places like Melbourne Ports and Melbourne here, it's a very small issue. But some of the important seats that this is going to be crucial for, that the Labor Party really has to deal with, are places like Brand, Lindsay in Western Sydney, huge issue in Lindsay in Western Sydney, and in the Northern Territory. So finally, the environment, which we said had tapered down as an issue overall, is still a big issue in places like Kooyong. Turak, 30%, more than 30% of people in Kooyong say that global warming and the environment is the biggest issue facing the world, facing Australia. And in Queensland, where it's already warm, it's obviously less of an issue. So, look, it's so important, you know. We live in Melbourne. I live right in the centre of Melbourne, and my worldview is shaped by Melbourne. So I have to be incredibly careful not to allow that worldview to sort of leak out and be what I think everyone else thinks. And this data, when we look at it by electorates, we realise that people who live in different places to us, their life circumstances are different, the industry they operate in is different. They just see the world very differently. So this is the whole story that we did about Canberra, and why you can't, from Canberra, understand what the rest of the country needs, wants and feels. But, you know, the very fact that global warming tops the list in the middle of Melbourne, you know, is just brings it home to us very, very strongly. So look, we'll take questions, but let me just summarise. The issues really are economic. The issues are about costs, cost of living, cost of electricity, cost of everything, cost of schools, cost of everything. Unemployment, big issue. Taxation and managing the economy. The powerful sleepers, I think, are the asylum seekers and the environment. These are emotional issues. They're sort of off the radar on a national basis, but it would only take an environmental disaster of any kind and the environmental issue would flare up so quickly it doesn't matter. Similarly with the asylum seekers and the immigration issues, something can flare that issue up very strongly, and it's something that people will respond to absolutely emotionally. It can change the election, as we've seen happen previously. So today's election is actually being carried out in a world where news travels very fast, where issues can flare up in a moment. A politician's slip travels really fast. Facebook, YouTube, it's all there. Our leaders can't give one message in a marginal seat. They can't get all homely and cosy without the nation watching. You can't give one message here and another message nationally without looking two-faced or, you know, like you just don't know what you're talking about. That's a really, really important issue. It's a real conundrum. But the leaders will lose credibility if they get too down home and local
More
in these
credibility.
marginals. Thank you, Gary. What would I do without him? What would I do without Gary? So, the LNP looks set to win a close election, but anything can happen. And we must all remember that 22%, that magical number, 22%, make up their mind in the booth. We find it year after year, election after election, the number's 22.